The question I want to discuss tonight, though, is a more serious one, and it is, would Britain be a better place to do business if it were outside the European Union? Now, I know this is a sensitive and controversial issue, and one that raises strong opinions on all sides. But I think the reason I want to discuss it is that the tone and character of the debate in this country has changed, I think we would all agree, in the last months. The Prime Minister has promised an in-out referendum for 2017, and the polls say that a vote today would have us heading for the exit. Would that, as the Eurosceptics claim, be a golden opportunity to shake off the costs and constraints of an economically and politically sick continent and to build a prosperous future in a wider and more dynamic world? Or would it represent a reckless gamble? In the spirit of full disclosure, I should tell you that I have always been a believer in Britain's role in Europe. And as editor of the Financial Times back in the 1990s, I supported the case for the UK membership of the euro. Happy to discuss that over drinks afterwards. I'm glad this is one of the rare occasions when nobody took any notice of what I had to say. I should also acknowledge at the start that pro-Europeans like me have had quite a few disappointments to cope with in the last few years. The failure to complete the single market, the design flaws in the Eurozone that were so brutally exposed by the global financial crisis, today's bleak economic outlook, and so on. But so far, I think, most of the arguments on both sides have been based on questionable assertions rather than hard data. Wild estimates by the Eurosceptics of the cost of membership, wild estimates by the pro-European side on things like the numbers of jobs that would be at risk if we left. People say 3.5 million. I think it's a number plucked from space. Or the numbers, the value to average households of being members of the single market. Wild estimates on both sides. I'm going to focus entirely on the business story, nothing about security, governance, agriculture and fisheries, justice and home affairs, and so on. And I want to base my arguments, so far as I possibly can, on evidence. I think the picture is not as black and white on either side as is often claimed by skeptics and enthusiasts alike. But the evidence, I think, is clear for those who are willing to look for it. From a business perspective, it suggests that the risks of leaving the European Union would significantly outweigh the costs of staying inside. My plan is first to look at the costs of membership in areas like regulation, labour market constraints, budget contributions. I'll then examine what you might think of as the economic benefits of being part of the world's biggest trading bloc. And I'll look at that in terms of foreign investment in this country, the prosperity of the city, trade, and the country's strong university and science base. I'll suggest areas where reforms definitely are needed and are achievable, I think. And I'll conclude with suggestions about where the debate might head. First, the costs. Well, we all know that in any kind of guessing game, the words red tape and Brussels fit absolutely alongside each other. If you put them in Google and press the button, you get just over 1 million results immediately, red tape and Brussels. Our media is constantly, and fairly enough, having fun with the latest daft ideas coming from the wilder shores of the Commission. And businesses regularly complain that Britain makes a bad situation worse by gold-plating the regulations and so making them more costly to follow. But the fact is that if you are going to have a single market, you are also going to have to accept common rules. A single market is much more effective than a free trade agreement, which simply gets rid of tariff and subsidy barriers to trade. A single market grapples with much more, with non-tariff barriers, like the different regulatory regimes which are often a much bigger block to trade across border than simple tariff barriers. And for most people in this country, including our Prime Minister, the single market built on these common rules is probably the European Union's greatest achievement. As Luc van der Middelaar writes in a recent book, the fact is that building a market, unlike a free trade area, continually requires new legislation, which, even if mostly technical, at times involves deeply political choices. For example, in Europe's internet economy, who decides the rules on consumer privacy? In a European market for financial services, who picks up the tab when someone goes bust? And so on. Eurosceptics put very large, I think dubiously large, numbers on the costs, the gross costs of EU regulation to British business. But I think you should allow for the fact that some of those regulations would also be necessary if we were outside the European Union, and some of them bring benefits, such as access to much larger marketplaces. I'm going to suggest, therefore, that the net cost, I'm sure there is a net cost, but that it's much less than is sometimes suggested. One way of looking at this is to study the latest OECD survey of the United Kingdom, which shows that in 2008, the latest data they have, the UK was ranked the least restrictive, not just of all EU countries, but of all OECD members, including the United States, when it came to product market regulation, the least restrictive. And it's also high up on the list among those who are ranked the least restrictive for overall administrative regulation as well. It comes in on that list at number 7, as it happens. For its part, the World Economic Forum publishes every year a global competitiveness report. The number in 2012-13, the UK in this list came in at number 8, most competitive countries in the world, out of a list of 144, which I don't think suggests that the economy was being strangled by red tape. It's worth noting, by the way, that 4 other European Union countries, Finland, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Germany, came in ahead of the UK on this basis. They were deemed to be more competitive than the United Kingdom. Claims by businesses that the UK gold plates EU regulations are also exaggerated if you look at the numbers. A detailed study published a couple of months ago by the Department of Business showed that gold plating, if it ever existed, doesn't anymore. Now, of course, product market regulation is irritating enough, but labour market regulation for the Eurosceptics is even worse, and their hostility is understandable. The Working Time Directive, which requires a maximum working week of 48 hours, was introduced in the very different political and economic climate of the early 1990s. And it was brought in mainly to make the single market more acceptable to labour and to trade unions. It's had, in this country, a real impact on the public sector, especially on British hospitals that rely heavily on junior doctors to look after patients out of hours. But the consequences for British business today are very limited. That's because they can use, and they do use, an opt-out, allowing individual workers to put in more than the 48 hours a week. The Working Time Directive, along with its associated Agency Workers Directive, is a pain in the neck. It needs reforming. But I suggest it's not important enough in economic terms to be a casus belli with Brussels. And the British would not be alone, I hope will not be alone, in seeking for change. Implementation of this directive is patchy right across the European Union, and now 16 countries are now using the opt-out. That can hardly be beyond the reach of sensible negotiation to sort out. The more important point, though, I think, is that the UK's labour market has become more, not less, efficient and resilient in the past few decades, thanks in good measure to the reform set in train by the late Baroness Thatcher. Private sector employment in this country has held up astonishingly well over the past 5 years of depressed output. because workers have been willing to trade wages for jobs. That's in marked contrast to what's happened in both of the last two recessions, when unemployment rose much faster than output fell. And as a result, the unemployment rate in this country is currently running way below the EU average at about 7.8%, compared with over 12% in the Eurozone. And an index of employment protection legislation, again published by the OECD, shows that the UK regime is only slightly more restrictive when it comes to labour market rules than the US and Canada. And it's a very great deal less restrictive than elsewhere in the European Union. When it comes to labour market rules, Britain belongs firmly in the Anglophone camp, along with US, Canada, Australia, and so on. It's not in the same league as the likes of Spain or France. Finally, in my list, anyway, on the cost side, comes our contribution to the EU budget. That works out at around £8 billion a year, which is a half of 1% of GDP. It's a significant figure, half of 1%. On a per capita basis, for what it's worth, the figure is 180 euros a head a year, compared with an EU average of 205 and 241 euros for Germany. I think it's unlikely that we would save all our £8 billion in the event of a British exit. To take one example, farmers receive transfers from the budget of around £2.7 billion a year. Farmers are a formidable lobbying group, and they would be pressing hard for compensation from the taxpayer in the event that those funds were withdrawn. Anyway, I think it's actually wrong to look at the EU contribution in simple bookkeeping terms. You can, if you're a skeptic, you can say that's just a trivial detail. If you're in favor of the European Union, you can say, well, look, being part of a 500 million people market brings economic benefits, so we shouldn't just look at the bookkeeping side of it. The truth is, unfortunately, that it's just as difficult to calculate the benefits as it is the costs of EU membership to us all. So rather than dreaming up numbers on either side of the equation, because they're impossible to be precise about, I think it's reasonably safe to suggest that in the context of an overall economy, which is the UK, where annual output is now running at £1,500 billion a year, the costs of membership, after taking everything into account, the net costs, plus or minus close to neutral. And those who argue that the costs of EU membership are crippling British business have to answer the German question. How is it that a country with a more regulated market for products and services, a more restrictive market for labour, a higher EU budget contribution, has turned itself into the world's most successful exporting nation? So what about the benefits of membership? The most obvious to me is foreign direct investment. People, international companies, building up business activities in the UK, building plants, starting services, creating jobs. And this has never been more important than it is today. With household budgets under pressure, government cutting back, private sector investment will be a vital driver of growth and job creation in the years ahead. Foreign-owned businesses are a very important source as well of innovation and productivity growth. Foreign-owned companies are much more research-intensive than their British-owned counterparts, as it happens. If you look at the numbers, they account for 25% of all business research and development in this country, foreign-owned companies do, which is more than 5 times the figure for foreign-owned companies in Germany. And they've transformed whole sectors of the British economy, all the way from motor vehicle manufacturing to financial services in the past few decades. Inward investors now account for roughly half of UK manufacturing, just over 2/5 of the output in the services sector, although it's true that in value-added terms the figure is rather lower than that because they import a lot of stuff to make their things with. Roughly half of all European headquarters of non-EU companies are based in the United Kingdom. More, in fact, than those in Germany, France, Switzerland, and the Netherlands put together. The UK has been the leading destination for inward investment in Europe for many years, and for all kinds of reasons: language, location, the law, and so on. A survey by UK Trade and Investment, the government body, of the companies that it helped to locate in the UK during the years 2011-2012 shows that for them, the two most important factors for investing, for considering the UK, one was that other businesses like theirs were doing okay here. That's comforting for them. The second was that skilled workers were available. Those are the two tops. Number three, next highest on the list, came the United Kingdom's potential as a gateway to other markets in the region. Nearly 3/4 of inward investors rated this as either very or fairly important. For the Japanese motor manufacturers in particular, the UK has been an extraordinarily important launchpad for sales into Europe. And that, by the way, is why a number of them were actually lobbying to join the euro back in the 90s. Their investment has rebuilt what was a moribund sector and turned it into a major export earner with a heavy focus on Europe. 4/5 of the cars made in the UK now are exported, and the bulk of them go to other members of the European Union. In 2012, which was a bad year for motor cars in continental Europe, 75% of Toyota's UK exports went to the EU. There's a similar sort of story in finance. A survey by Citi UK of 147 location decisions between 2006 and 2012 found that more than 2/5 of financial firms gave access to European markets as a core reason for choosing London. Financial firms also place a high premium on London's attractions for talented workers from all around the world, including the European Union and beyond. And I should declare an interest here, as I am an advisor to Deutsche Bank. You only have to look around you to see that London is the place where many of the brightest young people in the world, in Europe, want to study, work, and live. But the country's success in attracting foreign investment cannot be taken as a given. Ernst & Young publishes every year an annual survey of the UK's relative attractiveness for inward investment, and the latest one you may have seen came out this week. It shows that Britain retained its lead in Europe, inward investment projects, last year, with healthy increases in the number of projects secured and in its market share. But the survey also contains, I think, some worrying features. It shows that for the first time, the UK slipped behind Germany in 2012 in terms of new projects secured, as opposed to reinvestments from existing foreign companies. 10 years ago, the UK secured more than 3 times as many new inward investment projects as Germany. Now, according to this survey, global investors rank us behind Germany as Europe's most attractive country for direct investment over the next 3 years. And Germany has also maintained its lead over the UK in attracting projects from emerging economies, notably China. Here again, I think there's a German question for the euro-sceptics. Why is China choosing a country that is not only locked into the heart of what they see as a moribund union, but which also speaks a language that is, to me at any rate, is almost as impenetrable as its own? There's more. The EY survey that I'm drawing this from shows that inward investment in this country is increasingly concentrated on London and the southeast. Outside London, the number of projects was nearly a quarter below the level of 2 years before. And the most attractive sectors by far for foreign investors in this country are business, financial services, software. With a few spectacular exceptions, the country is struggling to secure investment in sectors like manufacturing, chemicals, and electronics. So there is now a question mark over the flow of inward investment. And unless you believe that leaving the European Union would create enormous cost savings and new dynamism for business in Britain, and I've tried to suggest that it wouldn't, then it's hard to think of any reason why the current debate about leaving Europe should be anything other than damaging to the UK's attractions as a location for foreign investment. Financial services, of course, are one of the prime sources of inward investment in the UK and make up one of the sectors where the UK has real global strength. And anybody who works here in the city will know that there are now strongly opposed views in the city about our membership of the European Union. If you believe the gossip columns, prominent hedge fund managers are becoming close to the United Kingdom Independence Party. Lord Lawson, in his article in the Times last month, claimed that escaping from what he called the frenzy of financial regulations emanating from Brussels would be one of the prime economic reasons for quitting the EU altogether. On the other side of the argument, Jerry Grimstone, chairman of Standard Life and of City UK, has said, and I quote, "It is really poppycock to believe that the city can survive in its present form if it is not an integral part of the European financial services framework. London," he said, "must have complete and unfettered access to the wholesale euro markets." Growing euro-scepticism in the city partly reflects the broader national mood, as reflected in the opinion polls that we all see. But there are more specific reasons for this more hostile attitude here. One is the view, possibly not a mistaken view, that the regulations which have come from the European Union since the financial crisis have been shaped, at least in part, by the idea in continental Europe that the financial catastrophe was a consequence of the excesses of Anglo-Saxon capitalism. As François Hollande said in his election campaign last year, "Finance, c'est l'ennemi." Well, regulations that city critics believe have been influenced by this prejudice include the Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, but the two initiatives that have really got people mad, boiling in the city, have been the proposed cap on bankers' bonuses, and above all, the proposed financial transaction tax, the FTT. Although the UK itself will have no part of such a tax, the Commission has made it plain that the tax, if and when it comes in, will apply to transactions in the city if the counterparty has its headquarters within the financial transaction tax zone, say in Paris or Germany. And that's seen as the crudest kind of intervention in the workings of our financial markets. There's another reason for, I think, growing tension in the city on this question, and that stems from the nature of the Eurozone crisis itself. Eurozone members are being forced to contemplate deeper integration to hold the system together. This would include a banking union, of which the UK would not be a member. One concern is that the integrity of the single market could be jeopardized by the actions of the Eurozone core. And another concern is that core countries could attempt to discriminate against non-members. One example, the European Central Bank's wish to locate clearinghouses handling euro-denominated businesses within the Eurozone as opposed to here in London. So how do we unpick these arguments? I think there's no doubt about the EU's importance to the city. Wall Street flourishes on the back of a mighty US domestic economy. London, with no comparable domestic support, has flourished instead, in good part, on the European economy. In 2011, some 18 billion of the UK's 47 billion trade surplus in financial services was derived from businesses with other EU member states. The single market is of crucial importance to non-EU firms locating a subsidiary in London and operating across the EU through branches of most types of financial services. And that's because, like firms from within the EU, the single market gives them a passport to carry their services across the EU. If they're clear to operate in one country, essentially they can do business in them all. And if that passport was taken away in one country, there would, I think, be a temptation to move to another one where the passport was available. If the UK were to leave the European Union, I think the strongest voices in financial regulation would be those which have a cultural bias against what they see as London's form of capitalism, and which would be looking for ways to weaken London's competitive advantage. And London, for its part, the city for its part, would not be able to turn its back on an economic region which accounts for such a large part of its business. I think it's better for the UK to retain a seat at the regulatory table, working with allies, and there are allies, to retain liberal and open capital markets. And it's not a lost cause. Now, just take a look at what's happening now to the financial transaction tax, whittled and delayed, whittled down in the face of pressure from all across Europe. The German finance minister, Mr. Schäuble, was in town a couple of weeks ago, and somebody asked him about the financial transaction tax. And he said, "Ooh, don't worry, you don't have to worry about that." Well, in the end, the way things are going, in the end, and this will be annoying for the London Stock Exchange, it may turn out to be not that much more alarming than the stamp duty, which has been imposed on equity trading in this country for many years past. And our European partners will want us to be in this financial world, because bank lending is shrinking all across Europe. Banks trying to rebuild their balance sheets. Companies are increasingly seeking to raise money in the capital markets. And the US model, for that reason, is becoming more important to more European firms. In the US, banks account for only about a fifth of long-term company finance. In the big European countries, by contrast, the figure is nearer to 60 or 70%. Europe will need a bigger and more active corporate bond market to finance growth in the future. And London is much the best placed in Europe to provide it. It's a great opportunity for the city, provided we stay in the game. What if we don't? Well, the lights won't go out. In the words of Richard Nodd and Michael Sherwood, who are the co-chief executives of Goldman Sachs International, and I quote, "The threats would manifest themselves over time, not overnight. It takes years for businesses to move headquarters and for other cities to build the houses, schools, office space and services needed to handle a new cadre of workers. But," these two conclude, "large international and European companies see a Britain divorced from the EU as a much less attractive place. Threats to British involvement in the EU are threats to British business. It's one thing for a hedge fund manager to respond to an unwelcome tax or regulatory change by hopping on a plane to Switzerland. These people are highly mobile, and they can easily shift back and forth as the mood takes them or as the rules change. It's quite another thing for a large international bank with thousands of employees in the city. And these are the ones, I think, who are most likely to see a British exit as a serious threat to their British-based business." Now, trade is the next big area to examine from the business perspective. And here, the facts are reasonably easy to establish. Roughly half of British exports, roughly half, give or take, go to the European Union. A proportion that has, of course, been declining in recent years as the emerging economies have gathered steam and Europe has languished. Between 2008 and 2012, exports of goods to the rest of the EU from this country, goods, products, rose by just over 6%, whereas those to the rest of the world jumped by more than a third. However, our exports to these fast-growing emerging economies are still relatively modest on a sort of individual basis. We still sell more to Sweden than we do to India, more to Denmark than we do to Brazil. And one reason for this is that we don't produce enough of the goods and services that these countries now want. The OECD has analysed the export structure of the United Kingdom and Germany and compared that to the import structure of the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And what this comparison shows is that Germany is very strong in precisely those sectors where countries like China are most hungry for imports, especially machinery and transport equipment. The UK, for its part, is strongest in areas where imports to these countries are least important and in some cases face heavy protectionist barriers, such as in financial and business services. So it makes no sense to suggest, as some do, as some Eurosceptics do, that if only British business was less focused on the European Union, less preoccupied with its local markets, they could do a lot better than they are doing in the faster growing economies of Asia. The stuff we are best at, these countries often don't want right now. In the future, I'm sure it will be different. Coming back to Europe, I've already suggested how the single market benefits financial services through the passporting rules. May I look at a very different industry, Scotch whisky. An analysis in The Economist earlier this year concluded the EU is now the industry's essential sword and shield for conquering world markets. The EU still accounts for around 2/5 of all Scotch whisky sales. When a new country joins the European Union, apparently, for some reason, sales of Scotch whisky rocket. And whisky makers prefer common EU rules for bottle sizes and labels and so forth to lots of national regulations. It's just more convenient for them to have to do one thing. But above all, it's the EU's weight in global trade negotiations that's critical to an industry that still faces roughly 600 protectionist barriers of one kind or another around the world. Indians consume, I'm told, almost as much whisky as the rest of the world put together. But they mainly drink local hooch that would make the true Scot faint away in horror. And they oppose enormous tariffs of around 150% on imported whisky, so putting the real thing beyond the reach of all but the rich. So it's no wonder that the distillers, the Scotch distillers, are hoping for big things from the free trade agreement that the EU is now negotiating with India. The UK, I think, on its own, would not have anything like the same clout around that negotiating table. And this, I think, is an important point to emphasize. According to CBI data, the EU has now negotiated trade agreements that cover around 30% of global trade outside the EU area. And it says that discussions are in train that could take this figure up to around 70% of global trade outside the EU. In other words, British exporters don't just benefit from access to the single market, they also gain from free trade arrangements that the EU has negotiated with much larger parts of the globe. And the big one that's on the table right now, of course, is a potential free trade agreement between the European Union and the United States. An independent assessment was published last month, which said if it was successful, that agreement could benefit the UK by between £4 and £10 billion a year. No one knows what the UK's position would be in this world of trade were it to break away from Europe. Would it have to negotiate all these trade arrangements, there are 30 or 35 of them, separately, again? And if so, how long would it take and what terms would we get? Everything would depend, I think, on the conditions of an exit. One option, which is, some people like the idea, is that we should become a Norway and join the European Economic Area. Let me just quote briefly, and this is showing off. I don't speak Norwegian, but I read a translation. Let me quote briefly from an official Norwegian government report last year. It said, "The most problematic aspect of Norway's form of association with the EU is the fact that Norway is in practice bound to adopt EU policies and rules on a broad set of issues without being a member and without voting rights. This," the report added coyly, "raises democratic problems." I should think so too, especially because they also have to make a contribution to the EU budget. Norway is not a prospect, I think, that should set our hearts beating. We could become a Switzerland and do business with EU countries through a whole series of bilateral deals. But that would be very hard work, would involve trade-offs, wouldn't cover everything. With no agreement for financial services, for example, the Swiss have come up with their own set of rules which are more stringent than the EU rules. It's unlikely, I think, that the EU would offer the UK similar treatment as the Swiss, because we're just a much bigger economy, and I think especially in the aftermath of what might be a messy divorce. And of course, countries outside the EU, including Norway and Switzerland, don't benefit from its free trade agreements. And the Prime Minister has rightly, I think, knocked both those ideas on the head in his speech back in January. Lord Lawson goes a step further than Norway or Switzerland. He argues, quotes, that the relevant economic context nowadays is globalization, including global free trade with the World Trade Organization as its monitor. But the World Trade Organization does not offer free trade and does not cover services anything like as fully as the single market. UK car manufacturers effectively saved the equivalent of £1,100 per vehicle imported into the European Union in 2009 by not having to pay the common external tariff. These Japanese companies would not shut down shop if they were faced with such trade barriers, but would they add to their existing investment here in the United Kingdom? Europe is a vital market for the UK for food and drink, which is our biggest manufacturing sector. 9 out of the top 10 markets for UK exports of food and non-alcoholic drinks in 2011-12 were to the European Union. World Trade Organization or not, tariffs on sales to the EU in important sectors like dairy products would simply be prohibitive if the UK left the EU. I think there would also be pressure, by the way, from domestic producers such as farmers or car manufacturers to impose tariffs in return on imports from the EU with damaging consequences for consumers. And that's why prominent Eurosceptics, I mean a formidable and impressive Eurosceptic like Lord Leach, argued in a column in the Times the other day that exit would be a big mistake. Instead, he believed the UK should stay in the Union and fight every possible corner. The Eurosceptic think tank, Open Europe, came to a similar conclusion last year. It did a very big study, an impressive study of the trade story, and it concluded, quotes, "From purely a trade perspective, EU membership remains the best option for the United Kingdom." Or as the Prime Minister put it in January, continued access to the single market is vital for British businesses and British jobs. It's impossible to put numbers on the potential risks to the UK trade, this trade side of the story of an EU exit. But I think it's fair to suggest that the costs would be significant. Finally, under my list of benefits, let me touch briefly on a subject that deserves more debate than it's been getting, and that's science and universities. Britain's, we all know, has a very, very strong science base. In most respects, our science is stronger than pretty well every country in the world other than the United States. And that strong base has made it a major beneficiary of EU science funding. Nearly 5 billion of the so-called Framework 7 funding and 1.2 billion from the European Research Council, which in the latter case is more than a fifth of all the ERC's money, has been won by the UK. Earlier this year, there was a headline, just went by, 80 out of the 302 senior researchers awarded a share in the latest tranche of Research Council money, 80 out of 302, would be based in the UK, which was twice as much as the next most successful country. Some of our most successful research universities, our most successful and most distinguished ones, now get a fifth or more of their science research funding from the European Union. Research collaboration across borders in projects like the EU-sponsored Innovative Medicines Initiative is also important, and so is the free movement of scholars. Sir Paul Nurse, who is president of the Royal Society, points out that it was easier for our recent Nobel Prize winners, the Russian-born Andrei Geim and Kostya Novoselov, Nobel Prize winners both, to come to this country because they were already working in the Netherlands. In Sir Paul's careful words, looking at it from the perspective of science in the UK, it would be hard to make a case for us being better off outside the EU. And I think, I was talking earlier to Sir Roderick, I think the humanities and social science people would say broadly the same. This matters for our economy, given the importance of research and of brilliant graduates to innovation and productivity growth. So where do things go from here? The good news is that there is now a growing appetite across the capitals of the European Union for reform, both in terms of the governance and the operations of the European Union. This is something which is both important and new. Europe badly needs growth, and the current crisis provides an opportunity for changes that would have been politically very difficult in easier times. They're not easy now, but probably impossible in times past. Although the arguments for reform stretch well beyond the economy, there's a lot to go for in the business sector. The single market remains incomplete, notably in services, which is, of course, our strength. They now account for around 70% of employment and value added within the EU, but only for about 20% of cross-border trade, indicating the low tradability of services across this vast market. The 2006 directive on services left governments with too much discretion to decide what constitutes a barrier to the provision of cross-border services. And there are all kinds of areas where increased competition would boost productivity and quality and the UK economy. Construction and retail are just two obvious examples. Employment law could, as I've said, be made much less intrusive to reflect today's changed economic circumstances. EU-wide recognition of professional qualifications in a much wider range of professions now available is also important and, I think, achievable. I think, among other things, my list would be of things to work for would include create a fully functioning digital single market, as well as a single market in information and communications technology. Be more ambitious in liberalizing the energy markets and sort out the mess that is now the European emissions trading scheme. Push for more free trade agreements, and above all, nail a deal with the United States. Press further on the better regulation agenda. Make it easier than it is now to scrap redundant legislation. Some people say getting rid of redundant laws in Brussels is almost as difficult as passing new ones. Create an independent authority to vet proposed legislation for its impact on growth and competitiveness, and do a better job of holding back legislation like the financial transaction tax, which has been pushed forward for political reasons despite the obvious questions about its economic consequences. I think much will depend in the next few years on how the Prime Minister plays his hand. He knows that the way to achieve progress in Brussels is through consensus, not through threats. He also knows that he's not alone in his wish to deliver what he described in his speech in January as a more flexible, adaptable, and open European Union in which the interests and ambitions of all its members can be met. He has the potential allies right across the continent. The risk right now, I think, is that the only voices urging him to action here in this country are those of the euro-sceptics, and that political pressures could drive him to negotiate with one hand behind his back, setting out too many red lines and in the process unsettling too many of our potential allies in Europe. And this is where the business voice will be important. Business leaders prefer, quite understandably, to keep out of the political spotlight, especially if it's likely to expose them to the wrath of our Euro-hostile media. But what business leaders are paid for, and often paid quite well, is to assess, manage, and where necessary, mitigate risk. So if they believe, these business leaders, if they believe, as I do, that the risk to British business of EU withdrawal does indeed exceed the costs of our membership and has the potential to cause lasting economic damage to our country, then they have a responsibility to speak out now. Thank you very much.